ein Zeichen, dann bitte Totale, 2, Mail, Ton ist bereits aktiviert, das tue ich dann freischalten und dann geht es los, ja? We brauchen das, we need it maybe if we need to go in front, so that you don't be afraid if there is movement happening.
I would be fine if you, yeah.
It could be that we sometimes need to go in front.
That's fine. As long as it's enough room for you and I can stay, you know. I will cooperate.
Completely full. That's good. Aber wir brauchen eine Heizung. Aber Reserve.
Pauline macht ja das Q&A, ja?
Das ist eher. Wie kennt sich aus? Nein, das Internet hat ja zwar gefinkelt, weil der Hotspot geht ja. Also du kommst schon ins Internet, aber die Bandbreite bleibt aus. Ich starte das OBS und er sagt, mehr sind die ganze Zeit nicht drüber. Wir haben jetzt hier einen Kanalbindungsfoto, das ist das wie ein Live-View. Den hätte ich heute gerne getestet, aber es geht nicht Live-View aus. Den haben wir jetzt in der Vergangenheit entwickelt, da kann man quasi unsere Hotspots und alles anhängen und den PC. Und dann macht er eine super Bandbreite. Wir können das am Ende. Guckt mal nach 20 Minuten an, dass er sich verspäten wird. Dann haben wir 35 Minuten kommt er. Und eigentlich das Drehbuch, was er uns geschickt hat, sieht er jetzt doch nicht, er macht alles ganz anders. Weil er hat jetzt schon eine Möbelmaschine vor und noch 50 andere Sachen.
So heute nichts.
Oh ja, aber halt. Nicht exakt alles so. Das ist einfach so chaotisch. Wie gut, den habe ich im neuen Studio mit Licht und dann sind Boden aber auch grün. Er steigt mit seinen Straßen schon auf meinen Pinky-Boden in Ostwächter. Da gehen wir die Kugel. Und da haben wir die Boden Pinky gemacht, dass er das Einkontakt hat. Und das Material ist jetzt alles so eigentlich die Kamera, die Kamera muss etwas von sauber. Mach ich mal immer. Los.
Welcome to the library of the Institute for Human Sciences, and in particular, welcome to the annual Jan Patočka Memorial Lecture, during which we honor the legacy of the Czech philosopher, whose archive we are honored to harbor here at the Institute. Patočka was also prominently the co-founder of Charter 77 and spokesman. Living in dark times, he regretfully died in 1977 after a very lengthy and difficult interrogation by the Czechoslovak Secret Service, the Státní bezpečnost, STB. So I think, in a sense, the fact that we do have Patočka's archive brings together both the intellectual and the civic activist fighting for freedom in dark times. And I think in that regard, it is particularly fitting that we have Professor AXEL HONNETH here tonight to deliver the lecture. And let me just say briefly a few words about AXEL. In full disclosure, we have known each other for more than 40 years. We're not much older than that, but still. AXEL, as you see, is the Jack Weinstein Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University at the Department of Philosophy. He was also, for many years, the Professor of Social Philosophy at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University in Frankfurt am Main. And in particular, from 2001 to 2018, he was the director of the famous Institut für Sozialforschung in Frankfurt, the home of the Frankfurt School. In 2015, he received the Ernst Bloch Prize. In 2016, the Bruno Kreisky Prize of the Karl Renner Institute here in Vienna, and the Ulysses Medal, the highest honor bestowed by the University College Dublin. He just told me also that he received an honorary doctorate of the University of Sofia in Bulgaria. He is the author of numerous books, and I will only mention three: The Struggle for Recognition, The Moral Grammar of Social Conflicts, The Critique of Power, and the latest English translation of his work, The Working Sovereign, Labor and Democratic Citizenship. So please join me in welcoming Professor Honeth here tonight.
Thank you.
Just one word, sorry, Axel. We will do a brief Q&A after the lecture. And after all of that, we invite you to a drink of punch and some cookies downstairs.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ivan, for having introduced me so nicely. I don't know where to start from. First to mention, it's very nice to speak in a library and to see me standing next to not only Heidegger's full complete works, but also Horkheimer's complete works. So I saw that with a certain relief that Heidegger is not alone here. I feel especially honored to give the this year's Patočka lecture. Even unfortunately, I wasn't able to make a connection between what I have to say and Patočka's work. The specialist will have to tell me whether Patočka would have agreed to what I would like to deliver to you. I'm very grateful to the Institute for the Human Sciences, to the Institut für die Wissenschaften for Menschen, for having invited me. I'm especially grateful to its rector, Moshe Glenny. I'm also grateful to Ivan, who probably had proposed me. And I'm also grateful to Sophia Kos and Jakob Angeli or Angeli, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, for having helped me to make my trip to Vienna safely and very commoditely. So let me start. It is now widely agreed that it was only with the rise of European modernity that the idea emerged that we should conceive of the future as the continuation of a process of moral progress stretching far back into the past. Since then, we have become accustomed to seeing world history as a series of not uninterrupted but sustained moral improvements leading to the spread of social justice and individual freedom. Today, however, massive reservations are being expressed about this idea of moral progress, which are justified partly on empirical grounds, but partly also on grounds that are themselves moral again. And one will quickly have to admit that such skepticism is not completely far-fetched in view of the political situation in the world. Who could doubt that the great hopes of the years immediately following the democratic revolutions in Eastern Europe were dashed just as quickly as they had arisen? The ever-widening gap between rich and poor, the neoliberal unleashing of the financial markets, the newly ignited wars in various regions of the world, the global spread of dictatorial regimes, and the looming threat of ecological disaster, all these are signs that point not in the direction of further moral progress, but in the direction of the return of a social state of nature, of a war of all against all. However, the current criticism of the modern idea of moral progress does not start with these recent regressive tendencies to justify its own skepticism. It reaches much deeper and claims that not only is there no reason today to trust in a future increase in justice and peacefulness, but that there has never been a good reason to view human history from the perspective of moral progress. On the test stand, then, is the idea, familiar to most of us, distinguishing between moral progress and moral regression on the basis of a directional index that spans our present, so that we can easily locate where we stand today in the totality of human history with our efforts for freedom and justice. Have we been able to be sure so far, to use two arbitrary examples, that the opening of a mere group-based morality to respectful behavior towards strangers, or the legal abolition of slavery, represented unequivocal steps in the moral improvement of humanity as a whole, then, according to critics of the idea of moral progress, we can no longer make such judgments. For in their view, any such marking of moral breakthroughs would require constructing a grand positive narrative about the course of human history that would have to conceal so many old and new injustices that it could only be false, highly one-sided, and therefore arrogant all around. As I said, a lot is therefore at stake, not only an old and cherished habit of historical hindsight and foresight, but also more fundamentally the question of whether we can still make statements about moral progress or regression in world history at all. Some of this criticism of the idea of moral progress is certainly worth considering and requires closer examination, while other parts of it seem to me to be far too hasty and hardly worth mentioning. In order to determine the extent to which a criticism is justified, it seems useful to me to distinguish between two variants. In my lecture, I will begin with the first variant of this general reservation, which I call empirical, and from there move on to a second variant that poses even greater challenges to the idea of moral progress. Sometimes I have to cough because I have an awful cold, so I apologize for this already now. Reservations about the idea that we should understand human history as a process of moral progress are justified today with very different arguments. In this context, and in broad agreement with general usage, morality is usually understood to mean a system of normative rules that are intended to protect and strengthen the porous fabric of human coexistence by showing respect for each and every individual and treating them as self-determining beings. Admittedly, this formulation, which is inspired by Kant, only reflects one view of morality, but perhaps it can be said that it is generally regarded as the task of morality to align the interests of all people as closely as possible with the purpose of promoting the common good through individual respect for the freedom of others. Accordingly, we can speak of progress in the realization of such a morality whenever a further cultural or social obstacle in human history has been overcome that previously stood in the way of universal observance of these duties of mutual respect, and thus prevented the advancement of the common good. In what follows, I will not be interested in the many arguments about how such a concept of morality should be defined and justified. I'm aware of these inner philosophical disputes, but I will leave them completely aside here because I am concerned with the question of whether any notion of moral progress is necessarily misleading. The first objection to this notion is obvious and was raised long before the criticism that is widespread today. It says, at least with regard to the past, it is not possible to speak of a process of moral progress because this would simply contradict the historical facts. This empirical variant of the criticism, as I will call it from now on, not only brings into play as evidence for its claim that there have been regular dramatic setbacks in the efforts to expand the circle of people who are to benefit from the respect demanded and thus be recognized as self-determining beings. Rather, it is often also asserted that there can be no cross-cultural standard for what people worldwide would understand as an appropriate means of promoting the social common good and their own well-being. If we summarize both objections, it seems almost inevitable that looking back at human history, we have no convincing reasons to speak of a process of moral progress. This is either because we ignore the fact that such alleged improvements have never prevented a relapse into barbarism and exploitation, or one is guilty of the serious mistake of simply measuring the well-being and happiness of all people against the yardstick of a Western European moral concept with its high regard for mutual respect and individual freedom. However, this empirical critique only rejects the backward-looking idea of moral progress. With an eye to the future, such a vision of moral improvement is generally considered not only possible, but often even necessary. This dichotomy arises from the fact that even the most hardened critique of the idea that the past should be empirically viewed as a process of moral progress does not want to prevent plans from being made today for a future expansion of social justice and individual freedom. In a sense, there are two souls dwelling in the breasts of all defenders of an empirical critique of the idea of moral progress. For the past, they do not want to have to assume that there has been any objectively ascertainable progress in promoting the general good by extending conducts of moral respect. But for the future, they would like to see such an extension envisaged because they too cannot help but wish for a life of secure recognition of individual freedom for the oppressed and enslaved people worldwide. This unresolved tension between past and future, between the prohibition of a backward-looking and the permission of a future-oriented idea of progress, however, forms the crux of this empirical criticism of the idea of moral progress. For it is always assumed that we only have a practical interest in moral improvements with regard to the future, whereas our retrospect view of human history is supposed to be completely free of any such practical interests. In my opinion, however, the relationship between the past and the future is much more complicated or dialectical when it comes to affirming a historical progress of morality. The one, the prospect of moral progress in the future, is not possible without the other, the realization of such progress in the past. In order to examine this dialectic, we should ask ourselves when the need for historical reassurance of moral progress arises in the first place, and what convoluted relationship between past, present, and future it regularly puts us in. With very few exceptions, almost all of which belong to the early age of, or positivistic age of European Enlightenment, the backward-looking question of possible progress in history has almost always only arisen when it was unclear or disputed in the present which steps should be taken to achieve moral improvements in the future. At such times, when a society was confronted with new challenges regarding the normative regulation of its social order, it was important to know the complicated paths of correction and revision of older moral understandings that had led to the questions that now seemed so pressing. The interest in taking a look back at the moral history of humanity arose from the eminently practical need to find out today whether the path of moral improvement taken in the past was sustainable and resilient enough to be continued in the future. It is similar here to all learning processes. Although we know that we only learn from our mistakes, we only recognize these as mistakes when we remember the intentions that we previously failed to realize and for which we had thus committed the corresponding errors. If we don't know why we previously fell short with our intended actions, we will also have no knowledge of what to do next to improve our chances of success. If this comparison is correct, then it is fundamentally wrong to see the backward-looking search for evidence of moral progress as grounded in an empirical, even scientific interest. Anyone who criticizes such efforts for paying too little attention to historical facts, or even contradicting them in many places, fails to recognize that they do not aim for objective, empirically verifiable knowledge. They are not concerned with historical accuracy or factual knowledge, but with practical insights that help to gain a guideline for moral improvements in the future, based on an idealized story of the gradual overcoming of past mistakes in the application of our moral principles. Let us note for now, therefore, that the empirical criticism of the idea of moral progress fundamentally misunderstands its actual intention. Its aim is to generate practical knowledge that should make it plausible to us why we are on the right track in our current efforts to improve our morals in the future, having been repeatedly corrected by past mistakes. In his famous essay on the conflict of the faculties, Kant already mocked those of his contemporaries who seriously advocated the thesis that human history had so far actually taken a development towards more justice, mutual respect, and social tolerance. He was the conviction that history so far has been a narrative or story of brutal force, violence, and exploitation. And even Hegel, who is often criticized for speaking of moral progress in history in the form of an objectivist teleology, was convinced that something like this could only be asserted from the perspective of taking the side of reason, and therefore not in a completely value-neutral scientific sense. Both philosophers, Kant and Hegel, would have considered it foolhardy to assume, in view of the complexity of the historical process and its actual cause with all the atrocities and injustices, that human history has in fact only permanently developed towards greater moral improvement and greater freedom. They were both convinced that it requires a change of perspective away from theoretical objectivity and towards partisanship for the enforcement of the moral good, in order to recognize the signs and turning points in human history that signal to us today that we are on the right track. Using today's terminology, one could say that Kant's and Hegel's philosophies of history, because of their practical, present-oriented perspective, were actually genealogies with a self-affirming or vindicatory intention. They were an attempt to reconstruct the historical past, despite its many abysses and barbarities, in such a way that we have certain clues to show us that we are on the right path and therefore should have the courage to make further improvements today. In order to take the abstractness out of this idea of the practical intention of all efforts to identify retrospectively a line of moral progress in human history, I will use an example from the recent past. When the question arose a few years ago in many liberal democracies as to whether homosexual couples should be legally allowed to marry, one was well advised to first examine the past to see how we arrived at the point of addressing this issue today at all. In this historical reinsurance, it was important to understand the previous repeated corrections to the prevailing moral interpretations which, after centuries of taboo and prohibition of homosexual relationships, had gradually led to their first well-meaning tolerance, then their legal permission, and finally to the point of considering their legal equality with heterosexual relationships. These preceding steps in the revision of our morality had proved so irrefutable and logical in this historical test of endurance that it could be concluded that the next step ought now to be taken, and that homosexual couples should be allowed to marry in a civil ceremony. This last formulation also makes it very clear that the idea of moral progress also has the motivational purpose of encouraging us to trust our past insights and to continue courageously along the path that is recognizable by its conclusiveness and consistency. Not only to reassure us that we are on the right track in our moral endeavors, but also to encourage us to pursue them in the future, is the purpose of such a self-affirming genealogy of our moral past, a point that no other philosopher has emphasized more frequently and vehemently than Kant in his attempts to develop a philosophy of history with a pragmatic intention. However, it is precisely this position, according to which moral progress in the past can only be discerned from the perspective of practical interest in the future improvements, that the second variant of the critique now takes strong issue with. For according to it, there can be no perspective that is impartial or comprehensive enough to adequately take into account the interests and vulnerabilities of all those concerned when measuring moral progress in retrospect. The next step, therefore, is to examine whether a genealogically understood conception of moral progress can defend itself against the charge that it inevitably gives voice only to the particular perspective of a small part of humanity, namely the part in power now. This is much more difficult than defending against the charge that the actual course of history clearly contradicts any empirical assumption of a, if not continuous, then steady increase in mutual respect and individual freedom. So I come to the next part. This is now about the second variant of the critique. The second variant of the critique of the idea of moral progress, which I will call normative, claims that it is inadmissible to interpret the historical past as a process of moral improvement, because the perspective adopted for doing so is necessarily morally incorrect or biased. Those who argue in this way first indicate that from their point of view, the question is not so much one of historical accuracy as of the appropriate perspective, the answer to which must determine whether the assumption of moral progress can be justified. Not the historical facts, but the perspective adopted should be the yardstick for judging whether it is justifiable to speak of a directed development towards the enforcement of moral principles in human history. On this point, the second normative variant comes halfway to meeting the concerns I have previously expressed about objectivists' interpretations of the idea of moral progress. We agree that a line of moral progress in history can only be identified at all if a practical perspective is adopted beforehand, from which we ask what evidence in the infinitely complex past of human history allows us to be convinced that we have taken the right path to this day, and are therefore asking the right questions today with regard to the future interpretation and application of our moral principles. However, the second party objects to such an understanding of moral progress, which I have termed genealogical, arguing that there can be no practical normative perspective that is comprehensive or universalistic enough to include the interests and vulnerabilities of all human subjects equally. For so-called progress can only be discerned in the moral past if only the values and needs of those who have the power today to make such historical reinsurance are taken into account. It is not necessarily ill will that is implied by this suspicion, but rather an inherent defect in any effort to reconstruct the moral history of humanity in as impartial and unbiased a way as possible. As soon as moral progress is read into human history, the argument goes, it must be possible to identify successive steps of improvement in the moral regulation of societies, but from today's perspective, it is not yet possible to see which groups have been excluded from them. For in such a retrospective view, we can inevitably perceive only the needs and concerns of those people whom we consider worthy of respect at all, according to today's prevailing interpretation of morality. Walter Benjamin, who had a penchant for exaggerated formulations, summed up the suspicion that this raises in the simple, famous formula that any history of moral progress can only be written from the perspective of the respective victors. The perspective we have to take to recognize moral progress in the past makes us blind to the suffering of all those whose interest we cannot yet perceive in the light of the currently prevailing interpretation of our moral standards and principles. This objection, if formulated correctly, is serious and certainly not easy to refute. It is not simply asserted that any attempt to open up our currently held morality by a genealogy of its historical development towards the future must fail because we cannot, in principle, take into account those who we may include in the circle of worthy persons only in the future due to revisions and further moral insights. This is certainly true and can easily be demonstrated, for example, by the fact that from the then hegemonic perspective of the West, the American Constitution was considered a milestone of moral progress over a long period of time, although it did not explicitly restore the previously brutally violated rights of the indigenous people of the continent who were not yet recognized as fully fledged human beings. This caveat alone should caution us against identifying thresholds of moral innovation in the historic past all too lightly. For it could turn out in retrospect that they only actually benefited those who are deemed worthy of moral respect in the respective present. But no, the objection is meant to be much stronger and says that from such a perspective, we can easily make the error of mistaking something in retrospect for a step towards moral improvement, when in fact it could turn out in the future that it was only possible at the price of the oppression and exploitation of groups that were not yet morally considered at all. In such a case, we could have marked our historical past with stages of moral progress that could only be climbed because in the name of these moral achievements, many other people were simultaneously suppressed, exploited, and thus excluded from the most rudimentary form of self-determination and individual freedom. If we take the example of Kant or Hegel, of whom I said before that their philosophies of history could possibly be understood as vindicating genealogies, it becomes strikingly clear that such an accusation cannot be easily dismissed. In their attempt to understand the history behind us as a process of successive improvements leading to the morality they advocated, they have often and notoriously overlooked the fact that some of these advances could only be achieved at the price of the suppression of social groups that they did not yet consider worthy of moral respect or recognition. Kant did not see that the spread of morality of respect in parts of Europe was due to economic prosperity and political tolerance that could only be achieved internally in Europe through the colonial exploitation of indigenous peoples whose members, in his view, did not yet deserve equal respect. I mean, this is the whole debate about Kant's racism, which I think has clearly shown that his racism is not only a side effect of his empirical studies, but it is reaching deep down into the core of his own moral theory. And Hegel, blinded even more by all these Eurocentric perspectives than Kant, even recommended colonialism as a way out of the economic crisis of his time, although he also advocated a kind of universalistic morality of mutual recognition. All this is now sufficiently well known so that the question arises as to whether at all, and if so, then why, we should nevertheless hold on to the practical perspective of moral progress. What would it ultimately mean to dispense with it altogether and to attempt to proceed without any genealogical reassurance of a line of moral improvement? A first, albeit not very helpful answer to this question would be to ask those who reject the practical political perspective of moral progress how they actually justify the claim of its inevitable one-sidedness and partiality. In order to prove the thesis, do they not have to resort to exactly the same moral norms that they accuse the criticized moral conception of defending? After all, the criticism is that the latter has not interpreted its own principle of respect or recognition universalistic enough when it believed that it could tell the history behind us exclusively as a process of moral progress, and in doing so forgot all those who are not yet considered worthy of respect or recognition today. If it were that simple, the criticism of such self-affirming genealogies would be guilty of a performative self-contradiction. One doubts the validity of the moral perspective that is adopted, but one must themselves invoke its fundamental principle of universal respect if one accuses it of one-sidedness or partiality in its application to history. But the objection cannot be dismissed so easily. After all, it is not necessarily claimed by these people who criticize the idea. So it is not necessarily claimed that the moral conception underlying a self-affirming genealogy is partisan, but only that its genealogical application is bound to be partisan because it cannot anticipate from the present who in the future must be included in the narrative of progress as worthy of respect or recognition. This objection does not make itself suspect of any performative self-contradiction because there is no suggestion at all that the moral norms of universal respect or recognition themselves cannot be justified. Rather, it is only said that they must not be regarded as the source of a genealogy of moral progress because their impartial application to the past cannot be guaranteed in principle. Is this objection well-founded? And if so, what needs to be done conceptually to perhaps be able to refute it after all? To answer this question, it makes sense to return to the task for the sake of whose solution a morality of universal respect had been endowed with a retrospective view of a process of moral progress at all. Whether Kant or Hegel, both were convinced, I had said, that their respective ethics needed to be supplemented by a self-affirming genealogy. This should be able to show that history provides us with sufficient reasons to believe that we have taken the morally right path, and that we can therefore have confidence in our ability to continue the process we have begun by virtue of our moral and rational powers. Of course, the two thinkers had very different reasons for taking this step towards a self-affirming genealogy due to their systematic differences. But that is not of decisive importance here. What is much more important is that they both made one and the same mistake in the genealogical expansion of their respective ethics, the full seriousness of which is only now becoming apparent. Neither Kant nor Hegel saw that the moral principles they advocated and independently justified could in turn exert an influence on historical development that must subject not only these moral principles themselves, but also their genealogies to constant revision. This self-transformative character of a morality of mutual respect or recognition and the associated perspective of moral progress becomes most apparent when we once again consider the situation in which a desire for historical reassurance of one's own moral standpoint arises in the first place. We usually ask ourselves whether the morality we represent is the right one and can find general acceptance if we want to know whether we can continue to base our actions on it in the future. However, this focus on the future also implies the need to reassure ourselves of our own moral past, because we want to ensure that we have not made a mistake in the application of its principles on the historical path to our morality, which we now consider to be right. However, if many voices have since been raised to show us credibly that we have made fundamental mistakes in this application, because we have excluded certain groups of people on the basis of prejudice, greed for power, or lack of sensitivity, then this must force us to revise the morality we currently hold in all three temporal directions. We cannot avoid including the groups that have been excluded from the scope of this morality, which in turn changes the perspective from which we must view both our moral past and our moral future. Because we suddenly see that where we thought we had made moral progress, others were at best excluded or at worst suffering, and at the same time we have to learn what we should do in the future to correct these past mistakes. Every morality of mutual respect or recognition has therefore a self-transformative character. It cannot be immobilized, fixed once and for all, because by virtue of its own principles, it sets historical processes in motion that have an effect on it and constantly broaden its perspective on the past, present, and future. Kant and Hegel made the mistake of wanting to immunize their self-affirming genealogies of moral progress against such potential revisions in the long term. Both believed that they were in possession of a perspective that allowed them to reconstruct once and for all the path of moral improvement that produced the moral convictions they considered right. This attempt to immunize one's own genealogies against future corrections was wrong, however. It is the error that Kant and Hegel made together. If they had not, they would have had to recognize that the practical perspective from which moral progress can be perceived in the past must also change iteratively because of the repercussions of their own moral principles on the social world. Every practical perspective on the moral past must be understood as constantly correctable and must therefore move with the times because it has to recognize that its own moral principles influence the social world and give rise to justified demands for their reinterpretation. One way to imagine this is to think of a canon of classical works. Such a canon is permanently moving. It's permanently moving because we are always making or gaining insights how exclusive the canon was so far. So we are permanently in the business, and everyone being in a university know that, to revise our canons by reference to new insights that were pressed on us by those affected. This compulsion to constantly broaden the perspective from which we morally evaluate our past history can be clearly seen in the current debates about the significance of the abolitionist movement to end slavery in the US. For a long time, historians generally assumed that the leading representatives of abolitionism were motivated solely by a noble, strongly religious humanitarianism when they set out at the beginning of the 19th century to fight the enslavement of workers deported from Africa with reference to the God-given equality of all people. Not without pride, they pointed out that it was above all the principles of human dignity and universal respect which had emerged in Western Europe that had led a heterogeneous group of morally minded whites in England and the US to take a firm stand against slavery and ultimately put an end to it. In the meantime, however, due to more recent research, and not least the objections of African American intellectuals, the tide has turned considerably, and people are beginning to understand that the abolitionists were also so keen to abolish slavery because, from their point of view, free wage labor to be acquired in a labor market would be much more conducive to increasing capitalist productivity. What initially looked like an unequivocal historical sign of moral progress proved, under the pressure of further research and persistent doubt, to be much more closely intertwined with efforts to expand capitalist production relations. The line of moral progress that had previously been thought to be identifiable had taken a different course with this revision of the traditional view. It now had many more gaps and, above all, had shifted attention from the white abolitionists to the representatives of black resistance. However, if we take Benjamin's reference to the victor's interpretative hegemony in every history of progress seriously, then a merely progressive temporalization of the perspective of a self-affirming genealogy is not enough. The question is whether it is even possible to continue to speak of self-affirmation as the attribute of such a genealogy, once it had been recognized that the impetus for the gradual expansion of the morality of respect did not come exclusively from its advocates, but at least as strongly from those who previously felt that they had not yet been sufficiently taken into account by it. It was not so much insight, conviction or goodwill, but criticism, protest and rebellion that were often the driving force behind moral progress, which one has to look back on in retrospect in order to understand the historical point at which one currently finds oneself. In this respect, however, it would also be misleading to speak of this progress reconstructed in perspective simply as a learning process. If at all, this learning was usually forced from the outside, namely initiated and imposed by those who were convinced that they had not yet been included in the circle of people who respect or recognize each other. And the further we pursue this questioning of the perspective from which we have to reconstruct the moral progress of the past in the present, the more it becomes clear that it should actually bring other protagonists to the fore than those who generally dominate the historical scene. It were not moral visionaries, great reformers, or innovative worldviews, but oppressed and abused groups who, in the times behind us, have effected a gradual social expansion and universalization of the morality of mutual respect. If a genealogy of moral progress is to encourage us to be on the right track today and to have the courage to make further improvements, it must report at exemplary stations of people who, through their resistance, have forced momentous revisions and corrections to the prevailing interpretation of the morality of respect. The true heroes of such a genealogical narrative would be women and men who, from a subaltern position, had the courage to rebel against humiliation, exclusion, and abuse, and only through these struggles achieved inclusion in the circle of mutually respecting persons. The standpoint of moral progress consists in a constantly expanding perspective towards the future, from which, with each further correction, it must be reassessed what could be considered a real impetus and a true sign of a gradual universalization of a morality of equal respect. What we have to evaluate in retrospect as moral progress in human history would thus have become a falsifiable variable that, through repeated refutations, only gradually approaches the truth in an unforeseeable future. A genealogy of moral progress that is no longer self-affirming but self-critical would certainly no longer be complacent and thus free of any morally triumphalist Eurocentrism. It would have understood that it must, as it were, move along with the gradually enforced universalization of its moral point of view, and thus constantly expand the perspective from which the moral progress of the past is judged. The assertion of democratic statehood in the West is no longer as unequivocally evaluated as a step of moral progress as it was 50 years ago, because it had since then been recognized that the same state simultaneously used brutal force to maintain the system of colonial exploitation of countries of the global South. And we have long since become accustomed to no longer celebrating the establishment of the bourgeois nuclear family as a unilateral breakthrough towards more liberated couple relationships, emancipated from financial considerations, because thanks to feminist interventions, we have since learned to recognize it, the family, as an institution of male violence. And most recently, the protest of queer activists has once again made it clear to us that our entire concept of marriage and family is based on heteronormative premises, which might cause us to take a new look at our moral past in the future. Such examples could be multiplied, but I will leave it at this view at this point. They should make it clear that we are constantly in the process of correcting our retrospective ideas of moral progress, because internal and external corrections make it clear to us that blatant mistakes were made in the past in the application of our moral principles of equal respect. The only conclusion to be drawn from all this is that if we want to gain clarity today about where we stand in our moral efforts to create a more just world, and whether we have reason to continue on the path we have taken, then we need a genealogy of moral progress that is constantly aware of its always provisional and permanently correctable status. From here, I would like to take a brief look back at the end of my presentation at what I said at the very beginning about the current global political situation. This, I said, certainly gives no cause for any optimism, since the developments of the last 2 decades point not in the direction of increasing freedom and peacefulness, but in the direction of the return of a social state of nature. The gap between rich and poor has widened enormously worldwide. The ecological catastrophe is looming ever closer due to the lack of state control of capitalist profit-making interests. Wars and military conflicts that were long thought dead are re-emerging to an alarming extent, and seemingly stable democracies are transforming overnight into hybrid formations of populist governments with authoritarian powers. In order to keep a cool head in the face of these undoubtedly frightening developments, it seems to me that we need to adopt a two-pronged reflection. On the one hand, we should be clear in our own minds that there is no reason not to continue to regard the decisions taken in the second half of the last century regarding the normative regulations of democratic societies as moral progress, and thus to measure more recent developments against this as social and political regression. Based on our experience, there is no reason for questioning the moves to include more and more social minorities in the circle of mutually respectful citizens, because these expansions of our morality have by and large proved their worth. On the other hand, however, a self-critical genealogy of our moral progress also always prompts us to ask ourselves whether in our attempts to extend a morality of mutual respect and democratic participation, we have overlooked or simply ignored the interest and sensitivities of some social groups. It could be that, as so often in the past, we have made the mistake of triumphantly enthroning new freedoms and rights that either overburdened or even repel certain groups that hold on to their traditional values. If this is the case, as I assume, then we have to go back in our self-critical genealogy of moral progress to the historical points at which such alienation and disruption may have occurred in the face of moral renewal. We would then have to examine whether larger social groups, either religiously motivated or bound by tradition, have been so disturbed or unsettled by some of the moral innovations of recent decades that out of feelings of powerlessness, they began to oppose the entire process of expanding our moral standards and set about re-evaluating all values. So much of the spirit of Nietzsche also belongs to a self-critical genealogy of moral progress. It draws on the spirit of Kant's philosophy of history, but has long since adopted the idea of a dialectic of freedom and morality. The expansion of mutual respect and thus of individual freedom will always entail the risk of the emergence of counter-movements driven by frustration and ressentiment, which will have to be reintegrated into the moral community in order to continue what we are bound to do by moral reason. To do everything in our power to follow the line of moral progress that we can presently identify in our past, so as not to leave people, groups, or individuals behind in the project of enlarging the circle of the community of mutually recognizing persons. Thank you.
Axel, thank you very much for...
Sit here.
Yes, please. Thank you very much for that very dense lecture with many, many questions, and particularly bringing it in the end to the present predicament and political situation very practically put about leaving groups behind as we hope to progress in a moral direction. I will use the chair. I will open it straight away to questions. And I see Ludger first and then second question over there. So if we could have the microphone, thank you very much. And do introduce yourselves.
Yes, hello, Ludger Hagedorn, permanent fellow here at the IWM, colleague of Ivan's. Axel, thanks a lot for this great excursion on the standpoint of moral progress. I would want to take up your starting remark from the very beginning when you This is like, seems like off. Yes, it's okay now. Somebody who is directly behind you, you don't have to turn around, but behind you is Charles Taylor. And you might know Charles Taylor is a person who is very important to this institute. He has shaped research at this institute for quite some time, and he has this really outstanding work on, let's say, a critical look at concepts of individualism and liberalism, which I find still very, very valuable. And his latest book, surprisingly, is called Cosmic Connections. This is somebody that one would not have really expected. It came out very recently. There was a book release recently. It's Cosmic Connections, this almost religiously sounding title, and it really has much about it, but is basically about art and poetry as a kind of religion, opening up to the world and opening up to moral standpoints. I think this is what is very much behind it. It's a close reference to German Romanticism on the one hand, and also to Czesław Miłosz, a Polish poet who was one of the predecessors in this Patočka Memorial Lectures many years ago. Also, I think a very, very nice reference. I will put it to two questions or two remarks, this reference to Charles Taylor and the reference to his latest book about art and music and poetry, especially, that is closest to him. The first one, I think this was obviously not very present in your talk, this whole sphere of art and what it can do for moral progress. It's not something that is totally foreign also to the Frankfurt School. Just to remind of Adorno, maybe you could elaborate a bit on that. And secondly, and this is really very interesting, the last chapter of Charles Taylor's book is entitled Moral Progress, right? And he really tries to bind back all of his excursions into poetry to the question of moral progress, namely what does art, what does poetry tell us about in regards to ethical points of view. And once again, Czesław Miłosz is his main reference. He says he has learned so much from him, and poetry to him, to Charles Taylor, to Miłosz, poetry is not only about the world, but poetry actually shapes the world, and poetry has a moral, ethical view on the world and helps to shape the future world. I would be curious what you think about this. Thanks.
Yes, I immediately answer, yes. Yes, thank you very much. That's a big question. And let me try to make the best out of it in trying to answer it. First, a short remark on Adorno. I think Adorno is not somebody who would defend the idea that art, I mean all kinds of art, music, painting, poetry, is serving the purpose of fostering moral progress. I think he is not defending that idea, because he always thought, first, it's a little bit unclear how Adorno thinks about moral progress. He has, I mean, as we know, if you take the Dialectic of Enlightenment, he was rather skeptical with regard to moral progress. In the Dialectic of Enlightenment, he insisted, together with Horkheimer, on the idea that human history so far is only regress. Yeah? So he did not see himself being in the situation to be able to identify certain thresholds of moral progress in the past. Therefore, I think he also did not have the idea, which I would be in favor of, that art in the broadest sense has anything to do with moral insights and innovations. Yeah, I think for him that were two different spheres. Art was not about morality. Art was about expressing the non-identifiable, the non-identity, and invoking the possibility of a different relationship towards the environment. Probably a little bit in the direction of Charles Taylor's cosmic connections, but he would have avoided all these notions. Yeah, no cosmic there. His approach is too negativistic to imply such positive references. Anyway, in difference to Adorno, I think that at least one have to consider the possibility whether art, in the broadest sense, plays any role in increasing the chances for moral progress, because it helps us to increase our moral sensitivities. Yeah, I mean, that's a classical thesis, but I think it's a thesis that is worthwhile to be proven. I don't know exactly to what degree it can be defended, yeah? Whether one can really say that, be it paintings or music, helped people to gain insight in the limitations of their own moral convictions and to overcome these limitations. But I think one could say that at least some artworks had that function and played that role in ordinary everyday life. But I would hesitate a little bit to make a general thesis about the progressive role of art with regard to encouraging or prompting moral insights. I think there is always a danger in that idea because it takes away from art its, let's say, its autonomy. Yeah, it tends too fast to instrumentalize art for moral reasons, and there are some ideas of that kind I do not approve. Yeah, if you mainly observe art and you describe art under the perspective, does it improve our moral insights, our moral convictions, then this is a too limited view on art, I think, because art is not fulfilling such a purpose. And we know that from Adorno, and not only from Adorno, also from Hegel, the same idea. Hegel always resisted the idea that we should take art as fulfilling a certain social purpose. Yeah? And John Dewey, the same thing. It's not simply serving a social purpose. It is expressing something that has a huge value for us. And Dewey comes probably closer to Taylor than Hegel, but so if I understand Taylor correctly, he would say, what is the function of art, especially for poetry, I think, yeah, in the book, is to help us to re-establish connections to the environment, to the cosmic, that under the pressure of our instrumental requirements have become inaccessible to us. Yeah, so there is an ongoing process in modernity of making it more and more difficult for us to have qualitative experiences, to have experiences of the environment as something that we are connected to. And it is art that helps us to reconnect us to this cosmic environment. In that sense, also Taylor is not defending the idea that art is mainly serving a moral purpose. It serves mainly to allow us to make experience of a kind that we are normally not able to make. And in Taylor's case, it is the qualitative experience of an environment that speaks to us, yeah, that resonates to us. So it's a complicated question. I only wanted to say I'm very unclear myself about how to describe the relationship between art and morality.
Over there, second question.
My name is Rainer Bauböck. I'm a retired political scientist. Thanks very much for your lecture. I think I strongly agree, but I still have a question with regard to what seemed to me an underlying premise of the first part of your talk, which was the empirical critique of the idea of moral progress. And the premise seems to be something like a Walter Benjamin view of human history as piling up corpses and disasters so that you don't see the progress if you look at the facts of history. But there is another school of history, maybe a more recent one, that claims this is not supported by empirical statistics and evidence. Think of Steven Pinker and other people who say that in the long run, if we collect the right kind of statistics, we see actual social progress, maybe not necessarily moral progress, but we see declining mortality, more longevity. We see actually a reduction of violent deaths in the global human population, etc., etc. You know all of these indicators. Now, you might say and respond to this, well, that's not what I mean by moral progress, because this is not about measuring individual freedom and mutual respect. But of course, from a Benthamite utilitarian perspective, this might be exactly what moral progress is about. So I think you could respond in different ways. You could either dispute the facts and say, or say this is too easy a way to gloss over the major disasters in human history, especially in the 20th century, and we shouldn't be naively optimistic that this was just an era of history in a way, and there will be progress on the horizon again. You could also dispute the underlying moral philosophy, utilitarianism basically, instead of Kantian philosophy. But you could also endorse it maybe and say this is supportive evidence from a camp that is not my camp, but I can still invoke that kind of narrative that has a more optimistic outlook and add maybe the value of human well-being to the core values that you have defended in your own work. So I was just puzzled and wondering what your response to this kind of story would be.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a very good question and not an easy one, because I'm aware of those attempts, recent attempts, to give us empirical evidence for true moral, or said, social progress over history. And Steven Pinker is the one who impresses me most would be Tomasello, who is another, I mean, he's coming from a different field. He's coming from cultural anthropology. And he's also making the claim that we can have good evidence for claiming that there is, insofar, a certain moral progress in human history because the mechanisms of cooperation increased, and cooperation has become not only widened among different groups, but has become more reflective all the time, so that we are now in a stage of reflexive cooperation almost worldwide. Yeah? So Tomasello is also making similar claim. And others, I mean, you refer to all this research. Given my premise, namely, and my Kantian conviction at that point, I think all these ideas can only serve in my own account as indications of certain mechanisms that help us to understand why we claim hypothetically there is moral progress, which means the following. I mean, looking back at Kant, yeah? Kant made the hypothetical claim that there is moral progress, hypothetically. He clearly said this is not an objectivist view. We are not in the position to make objectivist claims about human history. We only can hypothetically claim, or we can look at history as if it is leading to moral progress. But in doing that, he also was interested all the time in the mechanisms that could help us to make our own hypothesis more evident and more convincing. Yeah, I mean, even if we believe we only can hypothetically speak of moral progress, we should have an interest to make this hypothesis plausible and evident enough so that it can convince not only us but many other people. And so I would take these researchers as fulfilling that position in my own account. Yeah? They are helping us to make the hypothetical claim of moral progress, to look at history as if it is entailing moral progress. They allow us to make this hypothetical claim more evident and give good proof for its plausibility. But if I would have to study these attempts, I would make exactly what you proposed at one point. I would study whether the concepts of morality they are using are sufficient enough, or whether they are general enough to have such a universalistic validity that they can be used without reservations for measuring moral progress all over the globe. Yeah? So utilitarianism is clearly, in my view, too one-sided. Yeah? It's a one-sided view of human well-being or morality. And with regard to Tomasello, I think his notion of cooperation, which I find extremely attractive, is also representing a specific version of how to understand morality. Probably that is the reason I think that ideas like mutual respect or mutual recognition are the most universal ones we can use. And so I would do what you proposed. I would claim that they are using notions of morality that are too one-sided and are reflecting specifically certain cultures. Yeah? The concepts of morality that are at home in certain cultures, the English culture, the European culture, whatever. But I see the point. Yeah?
Okay. Misha? No? Right here then.
I have two questions or remarks. The first is, I'm very skeptical with regard to the notion even of moral progress, because this moral progress contains an aspect of arrogance. There would be some people who would say, we have achieved moral progress and you didn't, so we are better. And we had such examples already in history. Think of the Reformation of Luther and before all Calvin, who said, due to the grace of God, we have better. In other words, we have achieved moral progress. And the others who have not received the grace of God or have not made moral progress, they are the underdogs and have not to be respected. So this goes exactly contrary to the idea to achieve more respect. On the contrary, this concept is very anti-respect, is very much arrogance, has a tendency towards arrogance. I remember now still another example of the Apocalypse of St. John. You may know better than I do. There, if my recollection is correct, there are 144,000 saint people. In the Apocalypse, St. John says there are holy people, 144,000. And the 144,000 were then better than the remaining humanity. And moral progress also, in my mind, contains this aspect of being better, having made moral progress, and the others who are lagging behind are the underdogs and have not to be respected in the same manner as those who have made the famous moral progress. By the way, Rousseau, in his famous essay, I think it was in 1750, has already said there is no moral progress with regard to science, progress of science and arts. So he didn't see any progress with regard to this one. So what in my mind would be better, and this is my second point, is not to speak of this, in my mind, very awkward moral progress concept, but to follow established examples of morality. To say, for instance, to name some people, Socrates was an example of morality. Einstein was an example of morality, and many others. So it would be better to say, let's try to find good examples, moral examples, and make some efforts to follow them. Probably we are not able to reach their standard, the standard of Socrates, the standard of Einstein and others, Max Planck, and what you have, there are many. But we should try in all modesty to follow them and not to blow us up as people who have achieved moral progress.
Thank you.
I thought by whole lecture was directed against this kind of arrogant understanding of moral progress, because you are completely right. I mean, the idea of moral progress was mostly misused by those who believed that they are representing in their present the most advanced standpoint of morality. And this is a long story of the claim of moral progress. I agree to that. But I thought that in the moment at which you say that moral progress is a concept that is systematically correctable, and it needs as a component its own correctability, then it is getting rid of this arrogance. Yeah, I mean, because it has to correct itself permanently. I made the reference or the comparison to a canon. Yeah, and I know it from the permanent debates we have at Columbia University. Columbia University is very proud of having the so-called core curriculum. The core curriculum is the curriculum every new college student has to go through. It is on the one side on the humanities and on the other side about big literature. This canon is in permanent revision since 50 years. Why? Because we always make new, I mean, we are not making new, we are not gaining new insights. We are forced to make new insights. We are first was the feminist movement. So we learned to increase the canon, not only to increase it, to simply change it and to take in novels written by women which were completely excluded before. The same is now true with post-colonialism. We learn to revise the canon again because we have made, it has made be clear to us. I mean, we were first to see, we white people, to see that it is a very arrogant, white concept of a canon not to include in it literature, novels, essays from writers from the colonial states. So a canon is in permanent revision. If it's a good canon, yeah, it is in permanent correction, in permanent revision. And I think the same is true for any understanding of moral progress. It has no fixed content. It has permanently to change because we are forced, and we means the people that are able and are doing this kind of historical self-assertion, this historical, let's say, looking back, finding out whether there are any indications of moral progress. We are forced to see that our previous understanding of moral progress was wrong because we left out a lot of perspectives. We left out a lot of groups that we simply forgot. I made the example of the slavery debate, yeah, on the abolitionist movement. This is a huge, debate, yeah. 50 years ago, everyone in the Western world was convinced that slavery was overturned because some white religious group were formed fighting against enslavement and slavery. Now what we learn is a completely different picture. Not completely different, but relatively different picture. What we see is now that these white religiously minded groups were also having an interest in increasing capitalist productivity by getting rid of slavery because it was a very unsuccessful economic model. So now we take a new look and we see that slavery was not mainly overturned because of the insights of some white religious-minded intellectuals, but because mainly of the resistance of slaves against enslavement. So That's a new perspective. And what I thought is to say is such a genealogical perspective in looking back to what might count as moral progress is in permanent revision, because we are not stopping to gain new insights. So, and this, I think, is meaning to get rid of any arrogance. The danger in your second, in the proposal you made then, is, in my view, to risk arrogance, namely to believe that it were exemplary figures of moral standing that are representing the best of human mankind. And I think one has to be extremely cautious with it. So the last 2 pages of my lecture were mainly directed against such an idea that we can be grateful to some big figures in the historical past to have brought about certain moral exemplary status. Because I think most of that happened under pressure by suppressed groups. So my revision of the concept of learning process was meant to fulfill that function. Yeah, I wanted to say probably we are thinking not correctly about how moral progress came about in history. It wasn't so much a learning process, but it was a process much more complicated where people had to learn. They didn't learn out of themselves, but they were forced to learn. They were forced to learn, yeah? They were required to learn. So I mean, the few exemplary figures one could probably mention are those figures which became the spokesmen or women of suppressed groups. Maybe that are the better examples than the ones you mentioned. So not Socrates,
I've said many others.
probably Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela, I mean, or looking back in the past, probably better examples than the ones we normally have in view when we in the Western world speak of the moral heroes.
Axel Honneth, thank you very much, and please join me in thanking Axel for delivering the lecture.